Ready or not, here I come.
He's gonna get...
Can't get to me in here. Ah! Hey guys, I'm Mark. Today's video is about how I made this solid walnut door for the closet down here in the man cave. Now, the cool thing about this door is I didn't want any hardware sticking out. I wanted to be very minimalist. I did not want a knob. There's so little space here. If I had a knob on it, it would try to punch a hole in this wall, and I wanted it to open as wide as I could. Well, without a knob, it's a little hard to pull a door open, so I put spring-loaded hinges in it so it pops open. And then the keypad itself is a digital thumbprint scanner, but it also has the ability to put in a key code and get in that way. And then the app that goes with it is really cool because you can program multiple users, multiple fingerprints, multiple codes, and then it tracks whoever's opened that log with whatever code or whatever fingerprint. So you can really know who's going in and out. I wanted it all this way so I could have a spot to keep stuff away from the kids that they shouldn't be getting into. I think that's enough rambling at this point. Let's get into the build. I'm going with a pretty typical 6-panel design for this door, but I'm having to fit it to a very atypical sized opening. So I very roughly sketched a scale drawing in the computer and started tracking down some of my thicker pieces of rough sawn black walnut. My plan at this point is to allow the material I have and the space I'm filling to dictate the final dimensions of all the individual components. Spoiler alert, this gets me into a little trouble later on, but I end up with a good fix for it. I worked my way through my stack of boards and marked up where each of the components were hiding, then I cut many of them to length to make them easier to work with. And by cut to length, I mean I cut them 6 to 8 inches too long to account for planer snipe and checked ends. Unless the project requires long boards, and in this project there are a few, I like to cut them to length first because it allows me to retain more of their thickness after going through the joining and planing process. If you have to even out all the high and low spots from end to end on a long board, you're going to average out much thinner than if you are surfacing a shorter board. After completing the milling process, I cut the boards to their final lengths, then started working on the joinery. Now, if you're someone who builds doors, you probably know all the correct vocabulary for each of the parts in a 6-panel door. However, I'm fresh out of space in the hard drive I call my brain, so I'll just call them what I think makes the most sense. If you somehow think that my lack of the perfect technical nomenclature makes it impossible for you to follow along with the narration and comprehend what's going on, then please leave me a comment telling me just how upset you are. The inner frame pieces get a dado along both of their edges. I was shooting for this slot to be 1/3 of the material thickness, but it needed to be centered. The easiest way to do that is to run it over the dado blade, then flip it end over end and run it through one more time. The top, bottom, and side frame pieces only get the dado on their inside edge, so I made sure to mark and cut those so the best grain would be on the front of the door. With the slots cut, I laid the pieces out so I could get an idea of what it would look like and started laying out the tenons. To get these sized right, I used a caliper to get the precise depth of the dados, then marked that distance from the end of a scrap piece. I set the depth on my saw to come up to the height of the dado, but erred on the low side so I could fine-tune it if I needed to. It's better to have too tight of a fit and shave off more material than to have some slop in your joint. I know that the edge of my sacrificial fence lines up exactly with the edge of my blade, so I used the caliper to align my workpiece to it, then put my magnetic stop block in place. Now I can hog off most of the material, slide the piece up against the stop, then make one more pass to end up with a perfectly sized shoulder and a process that's repeatable across multiple pieces. When making the cuts in these pieces, the shoulders around the tenon are the most important part. They need to be square and the lengths from end to end need to match your dimensions. The length of the little tenon itself isn't so important. If they're a tad short and don't bottom out in the dado, that's no problem. Their strength comes from the faces and shoulders. Moving on to the raised panels, even though this is a narrower door, I didn't have any material quite wide enough to fill the space with a single piece. So I glued together several boards to give me 4 tall panels and 2 short panels for the top of the door. After those dried, I cut them down to their final sizes, which is the size of the opening they will go into, plus the depth of the dado all the way around. Then, I subtract 1/4 of an inch so they would fit loose inside their slots and allow for some wood movement. Now the panels need to get the raised profile look cut into them, which I do at the router table. It takes a little while going in small increments, but the results are worth it. I've documented this process a few times in other videos, so I won't be doing it again here. But if you want to see the raised panel process from start to finish, I'll link those videos below. After the profile is cut, I carefully trim off some of the back side of the panel until it fits inside the frame slots. I start by cutting the short ends because the blade is hacking at the wood fibers in a direction that causes quite a bit of tear out. But after finishing with the long ends, any of that tear out gets cleaned up. I could have skipped this part and kept cutting the profile deeper on the front until the pieces fit, but I like this look better because it pulls the panel deeper into the door and the backside ends up closer to flat. With the panels shaped and a dry fit out of the way, I gave the panels a quick sanding because it gets much harder to do once they're tucked inside the body of the door. The final assembly and glue up is just a matter of slathering glue on all the tenons and trying to avoid getting it on the free-floating panels. The other important thing is a result of cutting the panels undersized to account for wood movement. If they're too small and loose, they can actually shift and rattle around inside their individual little frames. And even if they aren't now, they might dry out and shrink a bit and start rattling in the future. The fix to this is to put some kind of compressible material inside the slots around the panels. There are some commercially available products specifically designed for this, but they're generally sized for 3/4 inch thick cabinet type panels. With these heavy panels, I needed something a bit bigger. So I cut up a roll of round foam, which I just figured out after a quick Googleizing is known as backer rod, but it's basically just round weather stripping. When wood expands and contracts, it only moves along its width, so it's only crucial to get this stuff along the sides of the panels, but I also put it on the top and bottom to help keep the panels centered. Once all the pieces were loosely assembled with glue, I made sure the door was flush across the bottom, then clamped the parts together from side to side. Then, I pulled the clamps from the next rail down to the bottom to make sure that the center shoulder was tight before locking that one with a side-to-side clamp as well. I kept up this clamping routine until I finally had the top rail locked down. Then I measured from corner to corner to make sure, after all that work, my door was actually square. Once the glue was dry and the clamps came off, I sanded the frame to get the joints flush. I'm happy to report that this didn't take much effort because my joints came together so precisely. And for one last detail, I decided to bevel the inside perimeter around the panels. After making quick work of that with my trim router, I was left with some round corners, so I carefully converted them to square using a chisel. So now we're moving on to cutting the hardware into the door, starting with the hinges. I didn't want to freehand this and risk making a mistake, so I took some measurements and cut out a template with my laser. Unfortunately, the pattern bit I have needed a thicker template, so I used my template to make a template. First by tracing and rough cutting it, then using a flush trim bit to make an identical copy in some 3/4 inch MDF. The template works by lining the straight edge up with the edge of the material you want to cut, then referencing the inside of the pocket to a mark that I measured out earlier for the height of the hinges in the frame. Then I used a pattern bit in a trim router to make a perfectly sized pocket for each hinge. I cut the hinge pockets into the door jamb first, then lined the jamb up with the door itself and transferred those hinge positions to the door. This is way easier and more precise than trying to copy the positions using a tape measure. I wrapped these new layout lines around the edge of the door, then stood it up and cut out these pockets using the same jig. Now, earlier I mentioned how letting the material I had dictate some of my dimensions led to a bit of a problem. I made sure that the lock face I was using was narrower than the style, but what I neglected to account for was the length of the bolt itself. This mistake meant that the lock was going to end up floating out over the negative space over the raised panel. The fix ended up being to notch out a small section of the style, then to glue in a thin piece of black walnut in that place that was just a bit wider. The end result ends up looking like an intentional accent to highlight the lock, rather than a cover-up for a mistake. While that little patch job was drying, I quickly assembled the door jamb. It was a simple matter of drilling pilot holes through the top, then running in some screws to lock things together. I also added a matching board made of scrap plywood to the bottom as a temporary support to give these flimsy joints some strength while I continued to work on things out here in the shop. Back at the lock location, I pulled off the clamps and sanded things smooth again. Then, I used a portable drill guide to drill a massive hole all the way through. Then I flipped the door up on edge, and while standing on my bench, I drilled a second smaller hole from the edge of the door and into the lock hole. I traced the latch position, then milled out a shallow pocket, staying clear of the line, then fine-tuned the edge with a chisel. I dropped the latch mechanism in place, then used a self-centering drill bit to make some pilot holes. On the opposite edge, I used a larger self-centering bit to drill out the hole locations for the hinges. Then I drilled the matching holes in the door jamb as well. At long last, it was time to see what this thing is going to look like. I slathered everything in tung oil and watched all the grain come alive. After letting it drink up what it could for a few minutes, I used a clean rag and wiped off any puddles that were left on the surface. Let's finally get this thing put into the man cave. I drug the jamb downstairs and took off the temporary support on the bottom. I carefully moved it into position in the closet opening and started securing it on the hinge side first. With the jamb on the ground and flush with the front wall, I used a few shims to space it out and tacked it in place with brad nails. I moved upwards using shims for support and a long level to make sure the jamb was perfectly plumb and tacked it in place. Once I got all the way to the top and was happy with the position, I added some long screws at the hinge locations to really lock the jamb in place. These screws will be hidden by the hinges and will support the weight of this heavy solid door. Now I move the door in place and hang it from the hinges. With the door closed against the frame, I look across the top and can see that the gap is bigger on the lock side than it is on the hinge side. I used an oscillating multi-tool to cut just a fraction of an inch off the bottom of the jamb, which dropped that side and evened up the gap along the top. I once again used shims and brad nails to tack the jamb in place, but this time I didn't use a level because I wasn't looking for it to be perfectly plumb. All I cared about was keeping a consistent gap between the edge of the door and the side of the jamb. Once I had everything lined up, I secured it with a few more screws, which I'll have to hide later on. It doesn't take much to install the remaining hardware at this point. The deadbolt latch plate goes into the jamb, the latch gets pushed into the door and screwed down. Then the keypad gets pushed in through the front and a mounting bracket gets attached to it from the back. Then just plug the wire into the inside locking mechanism, mount it to the plate, and throw in some batteries. After a few minutes playing in the app, I had custom combinations programmed in, as well as my thumbprint for even faster access. And if the batteries ever go dead, there's an obscured little plate on the front covering up a keyhole so you can still get in. The last step in making this knobless door ultra cool is to add a few twists to the spring-loaded hinges so that it pops open when the lock disengages. Well, that about wraps it up, guys. If you were following along closely, you probably noticed that I missed installing the doorstop strips that go around the inside of the jamb, and that's because I can't find the footage I took of it. I didn't want to insert a voiceover on top of something that didn't make sense, so I just left it out and I figured I'd talk about it now. It was a very simple process. Laid the door down flat on my bench, laid the jamb down flat around the door, and with those two faces flush on the flat reference point, I just stuck these strips against the inside of the jamb, down against the door, and everything was perfectly flush and the tolerances were good, and I just brad nailed them all in and we're good to go. The other thing of note is it was very difficult to figure out what I needed in these hinges. See, everybody on the internet sells a self-closing hinge for closet doors that you don't want to be left open and walk into or whatever. Nobody markets them as a self-opening hinge. Now in my head, you just reverse it and you're good to go, but they didn't specifically say that. So I spent quite a bit of time thinking about springs and magnets and trying to make a way for this door to pop open on its own. I finally just ordered a set of self-closing hinges, and they ship without any spring tension at all so that you can install them and they're all floppity like a regular hinge, and then you just add the spring tension. Well, you go one way and the door is a self-closing, and you go the other way and it's a self-opening. So I was glad to have a simple fix for what started to look like a complicated problem. So if you need a self-closing or opening hinge, or a really cool electronic keypad that reads thumbprints and can actually relock itself if you put in the additional sensor, ZERP. All the links are down in the description. Go check that out. the lock, I even have a coupon code. I believe it's 20% off for that. So go check it all out. And that's about it. Thank you guys very much for watching. We'll see you next time.